Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you're at in the world. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Roddy Bergeron. I am the Cybersecurity Technical Fellow here at Sherweb. It's a mouthful of a job title, but with me today, I got Mr. Atul Bhagat. Atul, do you want to introduce yourself, tell us what you do, and tell us what your biggest fear is?
Biggest fear. Well, I'm the president and CEO of Base Solutions. I'm also a founding member of the Tech Degenerates. My biggest fear is a client calling me and telling me they have a data breach. Keeps me up at night. That's what it is.
Hey, that's potentially billable hours, right? No, just
Exactly.
kidding.
Well, yeah.
As someone who used
They're
to do a
good
lot of
billable hours and they're bad ones. Those are
uh,
not good ones, in
those
my
are not
opinion.
good billable hours. Yeah, someone who used to do a lot of incident response. Those calls are never fun, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for joining us today. Today's topic, we're going to talk a little bit about cyber insurance, how much it's changed over the years, what are we expecting, and how do we handle everything from client conversations to potential issues when you have to make insurance claims. Just advice and experience from you, sir, because you heavily involved in it. You've done a lot of work and probably helped a lot of clients get their cyber insurance readiness ready for them, or their cyber insurance programs ready for them. So tell us a little bit first about like what has your experience been with attempting to get your clients ready to meet cyber insurance requirements? Like, what are you seeing? What's going on out there? Just overview.
Yeah, sure. So I think over the last few years, we've really seen it evolve. Obviously, there's been a tightening, if you will, in the market. They are putting a lot more restrictions down on our end clients, depending on you know, the industry they're in, and we're seeing a lot more restrictions from that. So we went from a world where there was four questions, and the main question was, do you have antivirus? To now where it's, do you have antivirus? Do you have EDR? Do you have security awareness training? Do you have all these? And they're going down the list, and it's getting more and more detailed every year. And I think that's where we're seeing the biggest change is that now the the clients can't answer these questions on their own. They have to have you involved. Now, I do recommend any MSP to make sure they're not the ones actually filling out these questionnaires for their clients, because technically, legally, that puts you in a bind. So you can sit on a screen share and walk them through answering their questions, but do not answer them for them. But overall, they need us, and that's also where you use that opportunity to have those conversations about the technology stack they're currently using. Really get into it and dig into it, and say, well, if you're going to be compliant, you need X, Y, and Z. You can't push back on this anymore. We've seen pushback from something as simple as MFA,
Yeah.
and it's
Yep.
the simple response is, if you don't do this, your insurance is void, so you're
What?
wasting your money. So
Yeah,
you
you're
figure out what
agreeing.
you want
You're
to do with this.
agreeing. You're agreeing to these terms with your insurance. You're entering into a contract with your insurance provider. Like, why are you now telling us you don't want to do these? Right? Like,
Exactly.
it puts you in a tough position as a technology provider because you don't want to upset your client, but at the same time you have to make them realize the risk they're putting themselves in. Right?
Yeah. And I think in that situation, when for the longest time, it's like when we were talking about technology enhancements or security things you need to put in, it's, oh, we're just trying to sell you on something, right? And now it's, no, this is to keep you compliant and able to do what you need to do.
Yeah.
And it's a different conversation. The messaging is different now. So it's not just us upselling or trying to throw something at you to buy. It's, no, we're trying to cover your rear, if you will. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was wondering what word you were going to go with there, but yeah, I'm glad you kept it PG for us. I appreciate that a whole lot.
Oh my
But
goodness.
you touched on something kind of important at the beginning of the answer to that question. It's like
Yeah.
these used to be simple, and now I can tell you, I saw one that was like 130 questions or something like that, gauging because the client wanted a big policy, right? This comes from my MSP days, right? Client wanted a big policy, so they got in the weeds on everything from not just technology, but to governance and like risk management plans and all these other things. Like, so how when you have a client that thinks that just all IT does is just make sure the computers work and that the green lights stay green on this. Like, how do you have a conversation around like risk management with a client though? Because that's basically what we're doing here. We're trying to get the insurance company to take all the residual risk, so it's not on us anymore. So how do you get them to see the light, I guess, in that when you're having that conversation?
It's I approach it in a very strategic way, and we have quarterly strategic business reviews with our clients where we're constantly sitting down with them, and we try and not to, I mean, truthfully told, we dumb it down. You get over technical, you're going to lose. I mean, we do a lot of work with law firms. I'm going to lose a lawyer if I start talking gibberish and talking about this stuff. But it's just talking very specific points, like you understand legalities, you understand legal obligations, like you said, signing a contract, what you're saying, what you're doing, and what you're stating. Can you afford to void that contract? And the answer is no. And then you kind of backtrack it there, and you kind of start to peel it back in that conversation, and then you kind of go into that whole thing of, well, knowing that you can't do all this, what are you going to do? This is
Yeah.
what we have to do to put us in the right place. And then you kind of start to push it in and say, all right, we need to put these policies in place. I understand that these may not be the most welcome changes to your environment, but these are what's required to ensure that you're protected. And we'll do our best, obviously, to limit the impact of those, but this is what we need
Yep.
to do. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, and that's the thing, right? Like clients have to understand, like, I guess in financial terms, like, what does this do for us? Like, so what
Yeah.
happens if we have an incident? They don't understand the fact that like insurance has become so, like the margins and the amount of payouts for cyber incidents have become so huge that insurance companies are looking for any way to kind of wiggle out of that, or at least find a term or a condition that you didn't meet. So like how do you get the how do you make sure, I guess, through a readiness program, right? Like, so how do you make
Yeah.
sure the clients are doing the best they can to meet those requirements without putting them without putting them in a position where they won't get coverage, right?
Yeah, and that's there's a give and take in that, and you got to figure out what makes sense for the organization. And you also, and in some ways, we do an opportunity there when a client gets an application for insurance. Certain providers ask certain questions, and you also have to be able to shop around based on what your needs are, what you're looking at, and what's the risk tolerance for that business is the other side of it too, right? And so you look at it, and then you go through each checkbox that you said you did, and you say, all right, here's the solution we have currently in place that covers this, or this is the solution you need. This is the cost to do it. Is this a cost you're willing to take, or are you willing to take the risk of not being insured? Which one is more valuable to you? And some, I'm sure you've seen in the past when you were at your MSP. I mean, some will say, I'm willing to take this risk. I'm not taking on this added cost right now. It doesn't make
Yeah.
sense to me. And we're like, okay, that's fine. I'm glad you're doing that. Here's my document that says I'm not liable for this problem.
Yeah.
You've made this decision. This is on you now. But from a stack standpoint, I mean, we've always taken the approach of high security approach on our stack, and we emphasize it heavily because, I mean, if you look at the landscape, what do you hear in the news? It's always security breaches. So if you're not putting the best in class solutions out there, you're holding yourself liable anyways.
Yeah, yeah, it's always funny, I feel like I've been saying this for like the better part of a decade, but the old adage of like, oh, we're too small for something bad to happen. And what I have to tell people is like, you know how many incidents I've walked in that's like less than 20 employees? Like that's been the
Mhm.
majority of my for every big incident you hear out there, like like a colonial pipeline or something to that effect, there's probably
Mhm.
like 1,000 small businesses that have gotten hit in that same time period. So you don't really hear it, and it's something that we don't do a lot. We don't like small businesses normally don't discuss their dirty laundry either. So you never hear these stories. They're not big enough to make the paper. So like, how do you drive home the fact when a client says like we're too small for that to happen, or it's not
We
a
give them
major risk? Do you
examples.
do you accept it? Do you just accept it, or do you try to like let them see the
We
light?
try and push back. We give
Yeah.
concrete examples. I use existing clients as examples. I tell them, look, we had said client, they fell for a email fish. Next thing you know, $3 million was gone. And luckily they were able to stop it. They called the bank just fast enough to get the money back. But had they been even 3 hours later, that money was gone. And that's it's giving them real life examples. Obviously, I don't release the name of the company that had the problem or anything like that. But it's giving them concrete examples of, yeah, it's great you think you're small, but this happened to a 6-person company across the street. Like it's not like it's happening like from some random major corporation. Yeah, MGM, all these things. We hear about these hacks all the time, in the news, but you're not going to hear about the mom and pop shop down the street.
Yeah.
The news doesn't care about it, but it's happening on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And
I
so
think
it's providing those statistics and all that around it.
yeah, I think that's an important part of the risk story, right? So like we try, like and that's personally my own problem. I used to be very technical, like, oh, if you don't have a SIM or you don't have an MDR or whatever, like you're taking a risk. But when you tell a story around it, like I think like human nature is it resonates a lot better than like technical facts and figures and everything
Yep.
with your partner. So like telling stories, right? So what's like I guess what's some other takeaways you've had, like discussing with clients? Like what was something you the discussion you had with the client and they had like that aha moment? Like what was it? Like especially
So
with
you
someone
brought
who's
up,
like wanting to come
yeah,
to the table. Yeah.
of course. So you brought up Cloud SIM, right?
Yeah.
So we're obviously having that conversation a lot lately, more about MDR for the cloud, 365, all that stuff. And we're explaining to them, like, we want to know when someone from overseas is logging in, because 8 out of 10 times it's not someone in your office. It's someone who's not supposed to be. And we need as fast of an answer as possible to know what's happening so we can shut it down. Because if they're in, we're all in trouble. And so it's giving them those types of real life scenarios of here's what happened. We saw someone log in from, I think it was Iran or something. And I was like, I know for a fact not a single employee from this company is in Iran right now. We need to shut this down immediately. But it's having those real life examples of we want to be able to shut it down, especially now you look at it as MSPs, we're all looking at single sign on.
Yeah.
Wherever we can put single sign on, and this is like the route, right? It's
Yeah.
simplifying access. And I know there's been arguments that that's actually the complete wrong way of approaching it, which is a whole nother story in itself. But
Whole other argument, right?
yeah, whole other argument. But we won't. But let's be honest, most of the industry is moving in that direction.
Yeah, for sure.
In knowing that you need your Azure, for instance, if you're a Microsoft shop, you need to make sure your Azure is being monitored in real time to the point where you know if any foreign login's been attempted on any of those services. So you have to have those logins turned on and everything has to be turned up for that reason. And so that's how we kind of route our way through it.
Yeah. I remember our MSP days, like when we were starting to do this whole centralized automation thing, one of the big drivers behind that was because, we got clients with like, we had to set up 20 or 30 different accounts between. So we did a lot of legal. So you had your Office 365, you had your AD, you had their legal software, you had this, that, like
Mm-hmm.
Dropbox, everything else. How many times did I go in and post employee termination? You still have active accounts and things like that. So like SSO helping like limit that kind of issue, and insurance companies are seeing that, right? Because you say yourself, like it's getting more complex. Insurance companies are starting to get better understanding of where their risks are at and where their payouts are at, and they're starting to get better of data around where most of these issues are happening. So like, have you ever had, I guess, what's been your interaction directly with the insurance companies, right? Like, do you interact with them directly? What's the conversations going on? Like, what are they saying around the industry, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, we do work with some insurance companies. Coalition's one that works really hand in hand with MSPs a lot. I'm sure everyone knows that. And then you work with certain brokerage firms that are very popular that we've associated ourselves with as well. And I don't feel like they're out there trying to screw the MSP over. Everyone's trying to make money at the end of the day, though. And it is not in the financial benefit of an insurance company to pay you out. Let's be honest. That is, if you think it's in their benefit, you're kidding yourself. They are not out to help you. They are at the end of the day looking for exposures. That being said, they do have positive conversations. I mean, I know like Coalition runs quarterly reports on clients and they're sending out those vulnerability reports. You need to pay attention to them.
Yeah.
Because whatever they're flagging, at the end of the day, somehow your client's going to make it your fault. And a lot of the times the vulnerability scans are usually the website that's causing the error, but you need to be able to prove that. You need to go back and say to the client, hey, look, this is not us. We don't manage your website. Like, you need to go talk to your web developer and get this hole closed because technically you voided your insurance because they warned you that there was a critical flaw, and they're going to use that as their argument, even though it has nothing to do with the situation. But that's an easy way for them to get out of it.
Yeah.
Like you said, they're all looking for ways to get out of it because it's not in their business to pay you. So I think you got to be able to have those positive conversations though with the providers, have those engaging conversations, understanding what are they really looking for, because sometimes certain questionnaires are phrased in a way that are not clear,
Yeah,
and
for
you
sure.
have to be able to go back and say, well, we do have this product. It falls in this category, but you don't have it listed in that category.
Yeah.
And you got to push back and say, can you add it to the application? Because I know I've seen some of these online ones where it's a drop down and there's not even an other. It's like
Yeah.
6 options or none. And you're like, no, I have a seventh one. You just don't know about that vendor yet.
Yeah. What do you mean you're not using McAfee or Semantic? You
Yeah.
know, like that's the funniest stuff for me. I was just get a drop
Yeah.
down. It's all like the classic,
Right.
AV vendors, and you don't see like a Sentinel One or something sometimes on the list because they're
No.
not familiar with those types of providers. So
Right. But then right CrowdStrike.
yeah,
And you're
everybody
like,
uses
small
CrowdStrike.
businesses use CrowdStrike.
Yeah,
Please let me
well,
know.
we learned of a lot of businesses, right, that use CrowdStrike. So, like the other question is like, so you have these requirements. Sometimes your clients don't meet them, but maybe they have compensating controls. And I'll give you an example. We had one that was like, "Hey, what's your physical safeguards around storing data?" And it's like, well, they store they're 100% cloud, so all their data is in Azure. So like, really, it's not us up to physical security. That's Microsoft's job, right? So like, how do you have that? How do you push back? I guess because sometimes you do have to push back on some of the requirements because they're not applicable, or you have compensating controls. So how do you push back on that when all you get is a form and a question?
That's a good question. I mean, I've had scenarios where I've had to engage the insurance company and say, look, this is the way they're designed. Are they are they going to be compliant? And have them come back and say yes in writing. So that way there's at least some proof, some chain of proof that said at some point, some adjuster, or even if it's the sales guy for the insurance company,
Yeah,
he said you're covered. And at least we have that somewhere saying that we're under protection
yeah.
because we need to be able to show that later on if something does happen. Uh, I see less of that now. Now that there's more understanding of how cloud works,
Hmm.
I think that was like 5 years ago. I'd say yeah, you would see a lot of that gray area, or even in even the last few years, it's getting better. I think there's a better understanding of what cloud computing looks like as an organization. I think from a compliance standpoint, we're seeing it across all these regulations that we're seeing that people are understanding cloud computing and it can't be treated like it was when we had on-premise data.
Yeah.
And I think we're already seeing that. So you're not seeing as many of those types of questions anymore. But I think you have to be willing to have that pushback conversation and be that partner. And that's kind of where one of the things we did uniquely about 2 years ago is we went to every client and asked for their agent's
Mhm.
contact information. And we said, and the first question was like, why? And I'm like, we want to review your policy.
Mhm.
And so we sat and reviewed every client's cyber insurance policy and made sure that A, did they say yes to things they weren't supposed to?
Yeah.
B, was it really covering them? Because a lot of them think they have cyber insurance when they don't. And then you're like, well, let me go dissect this because the truth is you just have an addendum that's not covering you. And then C, are there things that are phrased in a way that need to be reworded or looked at again and, and have an open discussion about? So that way, when you're doing the renewal next year, we make sure we cover those bases ahead of time.
Yeah, and I think too, like understanding a little bit of coverage because when people say I have $1 million policy, they don't really quite understand what that $1 million covers because it could be 100,000 for PR or
Yeah.
maybe 200,000 for lost wages or things like that. Like it even though it's $1 million, it sounds like a lot. Sometimes it isn't enough to cover you though, right? Like so how do you help guide that conversation? Because insurance companies will probably try to get you to be like, oh yeah, you need a $10 million policy.
Yeah.
Whenever you probably only need 3 million or 5 million. So how do you help kind of get the client? How do you be that middleman to make
Yeah,
sure the
so we have that
client gets the right
conversation with
information?
them. Like, one of the things I'll ask is I'll sit down with the CFO usually or the financial person and say, what is the average transaction you're doing from a wire standpoint? How much do you wire usually? And they'll be like $10,000. And I'm like, all right, so there's your risk tolerance. That should be the max you ever have to wire. So that's how much protection you need. Now, if they tell me they potentially wire $1 million, you need $1 million of coverage then to protect you from a potential fraud wire. So it's having those types of examples and saying, would you? And then I had a question once I asked the CEO, I'm like, would your CFO, without you knowing or without making a phone call, wire $1 million? And they were like, no, they're not allowed to wire more than 100,000. I go, all right, that's the risk tolerance. Then that's where we are. It's those types of conversations of like, where can you, what's your affordability, if you will. I mean, it's the
Yeah.
same thing we have the conversations with redundancy of internet or why you move to virtual desktop or whatever. It's what is your cost to be down? What does that annualize? Let's take it over a week. What does that cost look like to you? And are you getting all those funnels being filled by the policy that you got?
Yeah. Yeah. I say
Yeah,
like so back in my MSP days, we did a lot of attorneys and we had real estate attorneys. So they were dealing in multi-million dollar wire transfers sometimes and
exactly.
those ripe for fraudulent activity. I think the first one I ever worked was like $350,000 wire fraud, just like out the gate. And they were just like, and I was like, man, that's a lot of money. They're like, yeah, it's not the smallest, one of the smallest transactions we've done this week, you know. So
Yeah,
understanding your clients like business use and how their business operates, I think is a fundamental part of
exactly.
that, right? Like a lot of times the IT side is seen as like just you're just the guys in the closet making sure that the IT works, and if we need you, we'll call you. But I think the shift needs to be on us being a little bit more proactive and having that discussion, so they see us as a lot more than just the IT person, right?
Exactly. And I
Yeah,
think it's exactly as you said, a strategic partnership. It's
yeah,
not just not the IT guy. You
yeah,
have to be able to become that strategic partner that you're always looking out for them in their business interests. So to do that, you have to understand the ins and outs of their business. It's not just about what they, what computers they have on their desk or what
yeah.
server they have. It's how are you using the system on a day basis?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that drives that value, right? So if you're doing a flat rate and you're
Yeah.
charging twice what the competitor's charging, if you don't show that value, they're going to go, then what are we paying you X amount of dollars for? And value doesn't have to always be direct financial. It could be an intrinsic value, right? So like they know you got their back. They have that good, that warm feeling that you know what you're talking about. You're guiding them in the right, like that drives a lot of that value with partners, right? And that's why I think like when we're having a discussion, like if we're going to break into a client, say break into a client. Let me rephrase that. If we're going to work with a new client. Let's say break into a client. We're gonna work with a new client. I'm showing a little bit of my nighttime activities there. But no, if we're gonna work with a new client and we want to gain trust and we want to bridge that gap between business and technology, that's where like cyber insurance readiness and discussion around cyber insurance happen. So like, how does that like, dovetail into when you're bringing in a new client, or potentially there's a new client that's like down
Mhm.
deep in the funnel, and you're like, I call it the dating before marriage, right? Like this is the
Yeah.
one, it's gonna happen, we're gonna sign, I'm gonna get on one knee, and we're gonna be together forever. Like, is you find that the discussion on cyber insurance is driving some of that discussion and getting that tight partnership?
Yeah, one of the first questions in our questionnaire when we first talk to a client during discovery is, "Do you have cyber insurance?" And then we ask for a copy of the policy because we want to know what we're walking into. And a lot of times I'm not trying to rat on MSPs, but a lot of times we walk into an environment and they're like, yeah, and MFA is checked as an option. Let's just use that as an example. And then we're like, all right, can we get into it? And then usually we don't see this until after,
Yeah,
like when we've already switched over, but then we go in and MFA is not properly enforced. And there's all this stuff. And the client's like, well, MFA was on. And I'm like, yeah, but it wasn't enforced, which I was like, honestly, if you got audited by the insurance company, you would have been voided in your insurance. There would have been no argument in this. There would be no way to save you at this point.
yeah,
And so, but it's having those types of conversations of like, okay, you said you have this. In our evaluation of the system, it's showing you don't. Or it's, oh, you have an EDR. No, that's not an EDR. That's an antivirus program.
yeah. Or
Sorry.
we do have one, but it's missing on like two endpoints. So you
Right.
haven't. So if the question is, do you have any more antivirus deployed or whatever to your endpoints, and you have two that doesn't, you have not fully met the requirements, and that's a potential
Exactly.
liability there.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, same thing when we're talking about just patch management, right? So like
Hmm.
everybody does patch management, but how many people are doing it well, right?
No.
And it was bleak. No, don't say it. We can't say it. No. And but that was a reality. Like even internally in our own MSP, I would literally once a month go double check, like, and we had just reports incorrect, or yeah, we were doing
Yeah.
patching, but maybe we had an endpoint or two that we were missing. So like it's a reality we have to face, like that thoroughness, right? Because when we're Like let's go back to our framework, right? Like we're doing like a NIST CSF, like the first column is identify. And like that's
Yeah,
part of the onboarding process, like identifying what we have and what we can work. Because I've always told people if you can't identify what your client has or the services they use or the vendors they work with, how do you honestly answer the questions on the cyber insurance policy? You can't. It's
exactly.
impossible. So
Yep.
like how do you like I guess how do you become that thorough? Like what is it a slow process? Do
It
you have the magic?
I look at it as a slow process, especially on an onboarding side of things. Like we have our obviously you have your pre-sales meetings, you have your implementation meetings, you have your meetings with the current provider, and you're trying to pull information, you're trying to get as much data as you can. Then we have a meeting automatically. We schedule a meeting a month out with the whoever our point of contact is and whoever else needs to be there. And usually we prefer C-level people because usually we're identifying things that nobody looked at and they have to get fixed. And so we have that within a month, we're having a conversation saying, based on our security framework and what we follow, or what you're required to follow, because sometimes we have our clients now 800, 171, or they're prepping for CMMC or whatever it is. And oh God, but we're, but we got to go through it and we got to say, look, these are all the holes we're looking at. And it's going to take time to close them. Here's your 9-month plan, if you will, or 1 year plan of how we're going to get to that point. And obviously, if there are things that are related to cybersecurity insurance, that's more of an immediate thing. We can't wait 9 months.
Yeah.
A lot of this framework stuff like NIST and CMMC, we have time. We can figure those out. But with cybersecurity, this is you're technically void the day we've identified the problem. So we might as
Yep.
well close these as fast as possible and let's figure it out. And that's kind of how we approach it.
Yeah. The funniest conversation I ever had with an attorney one time we were doing their cyber insurance was like, I don't want to know of any problems because then I could claim claim I didn't know it was an issue. And I was like, that's not how this works at all. Like
Well,
you have a responsibility and of due care to make sure that you understand the ins and outs of your own network. You can't just throw that away, right? So
so in complexity of dealing with attorneys, one of my probably my longest standing client, I went to them a few years ago and I was like, you guys need cyber insurance.
yeah.
And the managing partner looked at me and goes, my job is to fight on behalf of insurance companies not to pay claims. Why would I buy insurance?
Fair
and,
question.
and I literally looked at him and I said, if it's a risk you're willing to take, go for it. I'm not going to stop you at that point. But I mean, that's literally what he said to me. And I was like, I can't argue that. It's true. He's like, my job is to poke the hole. And I'm like, oh, well, I
I
guess
what I say is like attorneys understand the word discovery, and I'd say as part of my discovery, I need to know if you're open to this. And that was
exactly.
I always use discovery. That's my favorite. They hated when I'd say that. They're like, "Well, do you mean actual discovery?" I'm like, "No, like we're trying to just better understand your network. We're not trying to do any kind of legal issues, right?" But you
Yeah.
talked a little bit about CMMC. So how deep do you want to get into CMMC right now?
I don't know. It's a beast. I'm not Mark Menzies. I
Yeah.
can't have that
Well, I'm
conversation.
pretty sure Mark said CMMC's dead. So like we gotta. No, no,
In
but like
all honesty, though, I will say CMMC is just the start of what we're starting to see as an industry.
yeah,
Um, I think Rod, you and I've had this conversation before. The industry as a whole needs regulation,
yeah,
and we're going to get to it hopefully over the next few years, and we're going to be forced into it. But it's good for in the long run. It'll be good for the industry as a
yeah,
whole.
yeah.
So
I was at DEF CON in Vegas, and Jen Easterly from CISA was there, and she's like, we've tried. We tried self-regulation. That doesn't seem to be working. We've tried through insurance. Like insurance
yeah,
is another. That's not working. We're very hesitant to have federal regulation come in. So like, what's the solution? She's like, we need to go back to not talking about self-regulation, but talking about community-driven regulation,
community.
right?
Yeah,
Like, can we work with insurance as a from a community perspective? Because they understand risk, right? That's the
yeah.
whole job of insurance is to make money by better understanding risk. So can we use that as a way of self-regulation, or do you think, hey, no, this is we have to have a strong hand,
Well, when you think about it, every industry, if you're a CPA, if you're a doctor, if you're a lawyer, you're continuing education, CLAs, all this stuff is a requirement.
Yeah.
Yet we don't have any. and that's frightening.
Yeah, there's no
Uh,
floor.
there's no floor,
Yeah.
and it's a shame because what's going to happen eventually, in my personal belief, is you're going to get this bottom layer, and then there's this top tier, and this bottom layer is going to pull this top tier down because the exposures are going to still happen, and then us as an entire industry are just going to look bad,
Yeah.
and there's
Yeah.
nothing we can do about it because we're just going to get associated with the bad. And
Yeah.
that's why we need to have conversations like today about cyber insurance and all this stuff. This is why it's so important to constantly have this conversation of how do we improve as a whole, as
Yeah.
an industry, and really get
And
behind it.
yeah, one of those things like in a non-regulated industry, right, where we don't have like you're not following a HIPAA, or you're not following like a PCI DSS, or you're not following any one of the normal privacy laws out there.
Yeah.
What drives better compliance or better alignment to good security practices? So what's the influence there? And it's insurance.
It's
It's
insurance. Yeah.
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 So like, we've got CMMC over here, right? And that's driving regulations. So like, have you seen any kind of changes in cyber insurance around like regulatory needs? Like, are regulatory needs asking for cyber insurance? Are insurance companies asking, do you have to meet are you meeting certain
So
regulatory
there,
requirements?
I haven't seen, I'm trying to think, I don't think I've seen a specific insurance application specify like a, do you follow CSF or whatever, or NIST 800 171. I've never seen them explicitly say that. What I am seeing, which is unique, is co-partnerships. So a lot of law firms who work with other companies, and these are more Fortune 500 companies. I've seen Fortune 500 companies ask for the framework that the small firms are following.
Interesting.
And this
So
is the
like
first time I've seen
ISO,
it like a year ago. I literally had a big box store company ask a law firm, are you following which cybersecurity framework do you follow?
yeah,
They gave them choices. They didn't have to follow a specific, like one specific one. They said, we need to know you're following one of them,
yeah,
your compliance and how you're following. And then we went through an audit based on that. And we put the law firm through that audit based on, actually we ended up doing CSF. And so that's what we did. And we walked them through it, and then we found holes and we closed them up based on it because they wanted to be able to work with this company. And that's how they had to do it. So, like you said, insurance is pushing one thing. Insurance is, in my opinion, at least so far, has been very specific. Do you have this? Do you have this? Do you have this? They're not going after the full framework quite yet, but like you said, that 130 questions is going to become 600 questions.
yeah,
And that's when it's basically you just answered an entire framework.
yeah,
Because at the end of the day, you look at 800 171, it's 120 controls. You just answered all the questions.
yeah.
It's the same thing. It's just how it's been phrased. And so I think it's all tying together in the long run. It's all going to end up in the same place. It's just they may not say it the same way.
Yeah. Do you think following a framework though, like that should help with like, so let's say you're building a cyber insurance readiness program. Does following a framework, is
Yeah.
that like your first step?
I think absolutely. I think every MSP, it's in their interest to say we're following, for instance, for most of our clients, we follow 800 171 as our base framework. That by and large will check mark almost 95% of the controls you need to do for any compliance check. So when you look at it from that standpoint, if you're taking that approach with every client, you're saying, look, we're going to try and push you through this. Now you're obviously going to get the small, really small clients that are going to be like, I can't do this. This doesn't make sense. And you adapt and you adjust, or you choose they're not your client anymore. That's
Yeah.
a choice that the MSP has to make. But I think selecting a framework that you want to follow as an MSP is critical to ensuring the smoothest process for your team and for your environments in general from that
Yeah.
standpoint.
Yeah. So that's changing, and we've seen the evolution, like you said, of the requirements that are needed, and we're gonna get to a point. So it used to be, the big thing was like, what do you have a firewall? Do you have antivirus? And it kind of evolved, right? We're seeing now you got to do vulnerability management. Now you need to use a SOC or an MDR or
Mhm.
some of the more advanced things. So what's the next? What do you think insurance is going to ask for next? Like, look into your magic 8 ball, your crystal ball, whatever you
I
have.
think I think you actually said one. I don't think you realize it. I think SOC is the next one.
Oh,
I think we saw antivirus, we saw security awareness training, we saw MFA,
yeah,
we saw EDR this year. I think next year the next conversation is going to be, do you have a SOC
yeah,
watching your stuff? and explaining that managed SOC or SOC. I'm curious how they're going to phrase that, because that's going to be tricky too, because we all know there's what is the true definition of a SOC and how that it's a gray area, and
Tell you what,
are we really
I'm gonna
checking the
put you on
box?
the spot. I'm gonna put you on the spot. Could you describe on an insurance application the difference between an MDR and a SOC, like a full MDR, like in a SOC? Because I struggle with that. I struggle
I
explaining
don't.
that to people.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
That's the gray area, because they're doing the same thing in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
and it's that whole thing, and it's what are you, and then it's pushing back on each other. What are you hoping to look for? Like, you're asking if I have a firewall, but if I'm a completely virtual firm, I don't have a firewall. So what is a SOC looking at then? It's just
Yeah.
what the MDR is looking at. It's the same data.
Yeah.
But then it goes into logging. That's the other question, right? Your MDRs have limitations in logging sometimes. Usually it's 30 days is your base logging. SOCs are a year. So if an insurance company wants 1 year of logging, then you might have to go into either a deeper SIM, or you got to get full SOC monitoring on that side. So I think
That was
that's where it's going to come into play.
I had this internal debate at Sherweb because we had a client that was like, "Hey, we need a SIM, right?" It's like, do you need a SIM, or would an EDR with an XDR add-in that's ingesting logs work the same way? Because like at that point, you're starting to split hairs on the
Right.
difference, and I think that's where a discussion with the insurance carrier and your clients are helping understand the difference. And if it's a hard requirement for a SIM, because like NIST requires that you have a SIM when you're doing, because we had some clients that used to have to do DFARS compliance, and like
Yeah.
you have to have a SIM. Well, we had an MDR product that could ingest other sources of
Is
logs.
that not a SIM?
It's not a sim though, and it's not a the
Not called a
consultant told
SIM,
us
but it
no,
functions.
and it's like it's
But
the
it
same
functions
thing.
as
It's
one.
just functioning the same
Exactly.
way. Yeah. So I can tell you, like working with finance clients, one of the big things they brought to our attention, like towards the end of my time in my MSP last year, was attack surface management, right? Like the SEC is starting to enforce, we're starting to talk about needing attack surface management, things like that. Like we're seeing a few vendors in the space start to put those products out, but at what point is the insurance companies going to surpass the capability of MSPs to provide technology and services? Do you think that's going to happen? All right, like
I hope not, but
adapt,
um,
improvise,
yeah.
adapt, overcome. You know,
Well, and I
I
think
think
that's the thing, right? We got to keep adapting,
yeah,
and we have to stay ahead of the curve. And you can't. I don't think we can hide with our head in the sand quite the way we have necessarily over the last 10 years. I think a lot of it's been like, oh, these regulations are coming. We're just gonna ignore them and pretend like they're not coming down.
yeah.
I think that world is it's gone. We're not gonna be able to hide from them. We need to embrace the requirements and start to adapt our MSPs to be more versed and ready for those requirements
So
moving
like,
forward.
so you're an MSP, right?
Yeah.
You're ready to adapt. So like, where do you start? I guess like, do you say, is it through a security program? Is it through more GRC? Like,
I think,
what would be the first step?
yeah, I think it's one, first of all, identifying a framework that you're going to follow, and then finding, honestly, I think relationships with vendors, with your current stack vendors, whoever it may
Yeah,
be, Sherweb, whoever, and going to them and saying, we're looking to align ourselves in this framework to better prepare our clients to be more compliant with insurance and obviously with these frameworks as well. What products do you have to bring to me that are going to help me accomplish those? And it goes to that whole security control mapping, CIS controls, all of that, and figuring out what products are going to help close those gaps, and then start to build your stack again and relook at your stack as to how is it helping you close all those gaps,
yeah,
and then identifying the ones that are actually leaving you vulnerable, because there probably are there, and that's just reality. And then you go and say, all right, it's time for me to look at this, and I'm under contract right now, but in 6 months I won't be, so you need 6 months to vet,
yeah.
and you should be taking that time, and this is the time to do it and really start to look at all that. Then you move on to going to shows and all this stuff, and really go and look at these vendors in detail and figure out what you really need.
Yeah, that's been my big push with my fellow vendors, even when I was on the MSP side. It's like I can't just rely on your marketing to save me, right? Like we go to conferences, see the flashy
Yeah.
booths, we get the handouts, But then it's great. It gets your attention. It's like, yeah, this is a product potential need, but then you have to do your own due diligence. You have to run it through the ringer of, does this product cover enough gaps for me? Is the
Mhm.
cost worth it? All these other pieces, right? Because at the end of the day, you're doing risk management on your own, and you can't rely. Michael Slater kills me when I say this, but it's like you can't rely on a handshake and a steak dinner to like seal the deal. And like it's
Sure.
that's hey, and I'm guilty of that. We take partners out, but at the same time, you have to the MSP itself has to take some responsibility there and say, okay, cool, like like you're a great vendor. We love your community, and we love your culture you have there. Like, but let's get down to brass tacks. How do you actually help us reduce risk? And that's the
Right.
driving conversation. Yeah, yeah. Uh, so all right, so we've covered kind of like we've had conversations with our clients. Here's how you have conversations with your clients. But let's say hopefully it doesn't happen to you, but you have an incident, right? And
Hmm.
as my buddy Cody Kretzinger would say, is this a lowercase I or an uppercase I incident? Because we never want to call it a breach, because that is a
Right.
legal term. And there's one thing you get out this webinar, like as an MSP, never call it a breach. But
Nope.
how do you determine at what point it's time to call the insurance because this is bad enough where they have to be involved?
So I think it's a matter of sophistication of your incident. I almost have breached it. Look at that.
Don't
Uh,
do it.
um, you know, obviously, if you're looking at a ransomware attack, let's use that as an example. Your whole site's down. You're up shit's creek, and you need to. Excuse me. You
It's
need
okay.
to. You need to. You got to call them right away. You're not getting around that one. That's engage immediately because you're going to need a remediation team. You're going to need forensics. There's all kinds of things that come into play when it comes to a ransomware attack. I don't think there's any hesitation there now. Get your ducks in a row, have your information available, make sure your client knows who to call, be available to them for that conversation because there are going to be a million questions that are going to come from a technical standpoint that they're going to want answers to, and your client's not going to be able to answer them. So you need to be available. So from that standpoint, I think ransomware, you got to call immediately.
Yeah.
Wire fraud is a little bit more sophisticated, a little more different because you don't want to put a call into your insurance company if you manage to stop the wire fraud before it happens.
Yeah.
So it's making sure your client understands the steps that they can accomplish potentially beforehand. And it's figuring out the timeline of when it occurred to kind of work through it. And you got to be able to do this very quickly because obviously, as you know, wire fraud, it moves fast.
Yeah.
And so you got to be able to try and stop. So first attempt client needs to be doing is calling the bank and seeing if they can pull it back. That's part one. If
Yeah.
that becomes unsuccessful, then you get on the phone with the insurance company because then they're going to get the FBI involved. All kinds of things start to play into
Yeah.
play. But
Yeah.
obviously, goal one is to try and get the money back without the insurance company knowing because once you're flagged, your rates are going up no matter what you do.
Yeah.
So you might as well try your best to avoid that as much as possible.
Yeah.
Then once it gets past that, in that process, what we tend to do when we've had to deal with it, luckily we've been fortunate, we have not had to make an actual insurance claim on a wire fraud. We've been able to stop them the three times I've seen it in the 15 years we've been in business. We were able to stop it at the bank, so we've been fortunate. But during that time, I was doing forensic analysis to figure out which account got exposed, all of that, so then I could go backtrack and have that conversation with that end user that got exposed, figure out what happened, how did this happen, where was our holes, and where did potentially we even have to change our policies to avoid these issues because there could be certain holes in the way we've been approaching, say, a departing user. Are we not getting notified fast enough? Are we not shutting down the account completely? Is there vulnerability there? And then you realize that you had a hole there. Or it's, did we run our proper audit reports of global admins in the environment? It's
Yeah.
happened. I mean,
Yeah.
I've seen it. Like we've taken on a client, and I go in, and there's 4 global admins. The CFO, the office manager, they've all been made global admins, and I'm like, how are you all operating like this? This is the security 101 right here. There should be one global admin, and even that one needs a regular rotation of password. Like
Yeah.
you can't even just have that just sitting there. So it's having that kind of preparation also.
Yeah. I think
But
that
you got to be able
goes
to
down
prove
to
it.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah, having a
you gotta
good
be able to
incident
prove it.
response plan,
Yeah,
and working through it and making sure that it works. Because I had to work. One of my first incidents I ever had to work was a law firm, and they got hit with TrickBot and emo
Mm,
or something like that, way back
yeah,
when. And so it was bad. It was, I mean, complete ransomware. I mean, accounts compromised.
yeah,
We caught it real late, so we called the insurance company. Oh well, we did our incident response plan, which was get your legal, get your CPA, and
yeah,
get your insurance person in the room with us because we need to make a business decision. This is outside of
yeah,
tech right now. And the insurance company was like, "All right, we're taking point on this," and they called their forensic investigator to come in. But it was an 8-day lead before they even got on site. So like nothing
yeah.
could be touched, no recovery, no
Literally, they're
nothing.
stuck. Yeah. So
Yep.
what do you do there? And that's part of your that's got to be part of your DR plan, if you will, as well, right? You have an incident response plan that says, okay, this is what I got to follow. But what's your DR plan if you don't have a system for a week?
Yep.
What are you going to do there? How are you all planning to operate during that 1 week time frame where you can't touch anything because they're doing forensic analysis on everything?
Yeah.
So you got to have that conversation too with your
Yeah.
clients. Like, in the worst case scenario, what does this look like to you?
Yeah.
And can you function in some capacity without X or Y? You know,
That that was the biggest thing when I worked about a year and a half ago was they were like, just spin us up. We had a cloud backup solution, spin them up in the cloud. But I go, we don't know when they got access to things. So we could spin you up 30 days passed, but we don't they could have been on the network for half a year, right? They didn't have proper
yeah,
controls in place. So you spin them up in the cloud, you're dealing with a secondary issue and you
yeah,
look even worse. So like understanding the ins and outs and like not like letting someone else take like you can take the lead in discussion, but letting someone else start to make decisions like business decisions is the most important piece because you
I
as the
agree.
MSP start to make those decisions and now you're liable, and that is
Exactly.
always
You
caution
can't
people
be
incident
you can't
response
be
like
running point. Nope. You have
yeah,
to just be a resource at that point. Once an incident has occurred, you become a resource. You cannot be the lead in resolving their non-technical related decisions to the incident, if you
yeah,
will.
yeah.
Obviously, we have to make the technical ones. That's our job. But the business decisions, don't get yourself put in them because you will be held liable, like you said, and there's no coming back from that.
Yeah, yeah, and if you ever have to deal with insurance subrogation at that point, where now it's like, well, now
Yeah,
we need to go after your insurance because you were partially
exactly. And
liable.
that
Oh, yeah,
brings to another important thing. You know, Unfortunately, at least my understanding, a lot of us MSPs um, are not insured the right way.
yes,
So I strongly suggest you call your insurance company. You explain to them exactly what business you're in, because a lot of the insurance brokers don't understand what you really do.
yeah,
So make sure you're explaining it and you're saying, I need cyber insurance. I need general liability insurance that covers you even more. Get an umbrella policy.
yeah.
Get as many things as possible because, like you said, that gray area will hit, and then you need your insurance to back you up because otherwise you'll be out of a business. And
Yeah.
you got to be really careful.
I've been in instances too. I've had to go to court over our incident response, and I always tell any MSP that listens to me, the ones who are crazy enough to listen to me, I say, sometimes your response and your build up to an incident, like all the steps, questions you put in place, that's the difference between you having to swallow $100,000 and you having to swallow $10,000. Now, our MSP could take a $10,000 hit and move forward, but could we eat 100,000 or $1 million potential issue?
Not
And
easy.
that's the difference, and that's where the subrogation issue. You're always potentially going to be found liable in an
Right.
incident. How liable do you want to be, right? So making
Right.
sure you have reduction of errors, like you have your errors and omissions policies.
Yep.
Your insurance providers providing you enough. I started digging into even like was it directors and C-level insurance, where like if our if our clients have a structure like an actual executive structure and they're making decisions, well, what's protecting them from those horrible decisions? Because there's
Right.
liability there where people can come back and get them for certain decisions that made, like especially CISOs
Sure.
and it's your CEOs when they're making decisions. So that level of insurance, and like look, most people, probably most small businesses, are never going to have to need directors and what's the trying to think of what the O means, but like it needs that officers, directors and officers
Right.
insurance. So
Yeah.
like making they'll probably never see it, but it's a thing to talk about. Client may never your client may never need it, but if you don't talk to them about it, like where does the responsibility then lie that you never had a conversation with them about it? So that's
Yeah.
the I think the main takeaway from this whole thing is like even like don't put yourselves in your client's shoes and make those decisions for them.
And don't
Talk
make
to
an
them.
assumption either.
Don't make
Yeah. And don't
assumptions. Like
assume. Don't
yeah,
assume. Have every detailed conversation you can, because
yeah.
it's better to be upfront and have those conversations and know where you stand on them versus leaving it gray and they think, oh, well, we thought you were already doing that.
That's the worst thing to ever assume is that they thought. And same thing. I'm going to go off into the technical world a little bit, but like the worst time to have a conversation about backups is whenever you're doing a disaster recovery. Like
When it fails, and you're like, oh, that's what you meant by I don't have a great backup solution.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
or you weren't testing restores or whatever. And
Yeah.
we go back to the insurance piece, right? Like if your client signs off that, oh yeah, we test our backups and our MSP says they test them, and you go to do a restore and come to find out like it doesn't really work
Doesn't work.
or the
Yeah.
delay, it's a 10-day spin up time as opposed to instant. Your feet are in the fire now because you've signed off that recovery
Exactly.
works to their business objectives, and it's that's that conversation. So we're talking about mistakes. Like, which I always like to ask people this. We always make mistakes. I will say myself, I've
Of
made
course.
tons of mistakes. I, you know, can't always talk about them in public, but yeah, we've made some mistakes. Like,
Sure.
what's a key takeaway? If like, you could tell an MSP or a listener out there, like, hey, this is a trap, and I don't want you to fall into it. Like, what's something? What would be?
I my I would say be as detailed as possible in your MSAs, your master service agreements of what you're providing and what you're not. There's a lot of assumptions that you're providing stuff you're not, and being explicit in that and saying this is what we're giving you, this is what you're choosing to opt out of
Yeah,
based on what our recommendations are. You also need to be willing to do that. And I know it's not necessarily admissible, but sometimes just having it in writing saying you've chosen not to take this suggestion from me. I need you to sign off on that. You've chosen that. It's not that I'm going to use it against you down the road, but it's just me acknowledging with you that in paper, we did not agree that you did not want zero trust.
yeah,
This is a choice you made as a firm. You don't want zero trust on your systems because it's too burdensome, even though we recommend it. And
yeah,
having that audit trail that says that you had that conversation in writing, because I've had this. We lost a client last year where this office manager, she would call me incessantly to discuss stuff. Would not put it in an email, would not put it in writing, and then 3 months later say, "I don't remember talking to you about it." And it was like nonstop. We kept doing it, and we kept doing this song and dance, and it became frustrating. And I was done. I was like, I can't do this anymore. But it's that type of stuff that will burn you later, because if they don't remember what you said and they refuse to put things in writing, where do you stand? It's just your word against theirs.
yeah.
It's not going to get you anywhere.
Yeah, that was one of my biggest lessons learned in the MSP space, especially around that, is like not every dollar is equal to one another. Like, you got some clients that you're just too much risk for me to ever
Right.
want to touch, even though they was bringing in a lot of money and we were semi profitable.
At what
Right,
cost,
like
though?
that, just ignoring basic cyber hygiene or saying
Yeah.
things like, "Oh, our staff will never do security awareness training, like, so we're not
Yeah.
doing it." It's like, oh, it's a 5-minute video twice a month. Like, if they don't have 10 minutes, either they're lying to you or you're allowing the complacency to happen,
Yeah.
which
Which then you're susceptible to a lot more,
yeah, yeah.
and I don't want to take on that risk for our side. And so you got to be able to say, you know what, it's just not the right fit.
Yeah, it's part of the operational maturity journey, right?
I was going to
When
say
we're
that's
young,
growth and maturity in the industry when you can finally get to that point where you can actually say no to a client and say, I don't want you as a client anymore, or I don't want you as a client, even though you're calling me for my services, you don't fit what we want.
feels good, man. Like feels good when you can finally say
It
that.
definitely does. Yeah.
So, one question, and then we're gonna try to wrap up because we want to be on time.
Yeah.
Okay, wanna. So, last question: do you or will you or think about requiring cyber insurance for all of your clients?
We do
Okay.
actually. We require it. One of the things we started about 2 years ago, we told them you need cyber insurance. This is why we require it, and we explain as long we very detailed in our explanation as to the why, what the security risks are, and what the reasons are. And I've had basically no pushback, even from the smallest of organizations. And when I say small, I'm talking about two-person clients that have said, "Understood. It's cost of doing business,
Yeah.
and that's just the way it is." So education is key. Explaining yourself, justifying it, um, creating those potential JV partnerships with insurance agents to try and have those conversations together is a benefit too. So you can have those conversations with your clients. If you because some clients will say, "Well, I don't know who to call," and you say, "Well, I already have this person.
Yeah.
Come talk to them."
Yeah. And
And
if,
allowing
yeah.
that, having that kind of system and network, and saying, "Look, I understand you may not have cyber insurance, but I already have someone who's going to go out and shop your insurance for you and get you 4 proposals tomorrow,"
Yeah.
and
And if
being
and
ready for that.
if you've already started to build that trust with them and they trust that, you give them the right information, you have a good partnership that like further deepens that trust your
Exactly.
client has,
And you're
right?
further building that relationship, right? And
Yeah.
you're making it's the sticky points, right?
Yeah.
How do you get yourself to stick as that trusted strategic advisor?
Yeah.
Is having more resources available to them.
Yeah. And I always tell people like, especially as we talk about incidents, right? Like the deeper that trust is and the deeper value they get, like I always called it we have a goodwill bank with our client and we try to build it up as much as we can because eventually something bad's going to happen and we have to make a withdrawal. You want to make sure you have
Yeah,
enough reserve funds in the goodwill bank with your client
absolutely.
to pull to write a check whenever something
Yeah,
bad happens.
yeah.
Um, Look, we're getting
So
close to time.
yeah,
Also, thank you so much.
thank you.
Any parting words of wisdom?
Ah, always trust what this guy says.
Uh, I don't know if you're pointing towards me or if you're pointing out the window at some guy outside.
Exactly. Uh, no, all seriousness, I think we all, I mean, I've said it a few times, regulation and how we do things as an industry is important, and we have to hold ourselves as accountable as we hold our clients. If we want
Yeah,
to hold our clients accountable, we need to be doing it for ourselves as well.
for
So
sure.
just keep pushing along and keep pushing the message that we need to raise the bar. That's my
Ra-
biggest thing.
Raising
Yeah,
tides, and if you
right.
anchor yourself to the ocean floor, that's up to you.
That's on you. That's on you. We'll try and
Uh,
help you, but I can't promise.
Yes. I appreciate it. Look, everyone, in chat, we're going to drop a link. The Sherweb has produced a cyber insurance guide of how do you have conversations with clients? What's the steps to make it a readiness program? What's the ins and outs? So I wouldn't say I wrote all of it, but I wrote the majority of it. It's a very detailed guide. If you have questions about cyber insurance or if you're thinking about starting a readiness program, click on the link, download the guide, read it, give me feedback, yell at me. Things that you think would help improve it. As we always try to do, just not even as a vendor, but as a partner out there, like we try to make the space a little bit better. And if there's anything I can do to help anyone out there, feel free to reach out. But also, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
I hope you don't send me a bill for it, but if you do, make it out to Sherweb, please, not to me personally.
We can trade in whiskey. Don't worry. We're good.
I appreciate it. Thank y'all so much. Have a
All
great
right.
day.
Take care.